So maybe somebody leaves a premise statement or a conclusion statement unexpressed in an argument because the statement is so obvious that to include it would almost seem condescending to the person that we're offering the argument to. Or maybe there's something more nefarious going on. Maybe somebody's trying to sneak past us a bad argument, hoping that we'll believe it's a good one. They're trying to get us to accept an invalid argument as a valid argument. And they think that the best way to do that is to leave parts of the argument unexpressed that would make it easier for us to see the flaws in the reasoning of that argument. A third reason somebody might leave statements of an argument unexpressed, in particular premise statements, is that they may be questionable and they don't want to have to defend them. Remember that a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. So somebody might offer to us a valid argument and sell that argument to us as a valid argument, but they know that part of the argument involves a premise statement that's going to be really hard to defend. So if I just leave that premise statement out, maybe nobody will recognize that that premise statement is actually an essential part of this argument and needs to be defended, something I don't want to do. So take a look at this argument. Suicide is not immoral. Actions that do not cause harm to others are not immoral. Okay, so the first thing we want to do always is identify the conclusion statement and the premise statement, and we always want to rely on indicator words, premise indicators, conclusion indicator words to help us do that. But here we don't have any indicator words. And so the way we're going to identify what the missing statement is to ask ourselves is if one of these statements is being offered as a reason to believe one of the others. And I would argue to you that the main statement being made here, the claim, the conclusion, is the statement suicide is not immoral. And the reason they're offering as justification of that statement is that because actions that do not cause harm to others are not immoral actions. Okay? So I think that's our conclusion. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go term hunting. We're going to try to find identifiable plural nouns or noun phrases that we can use as the terms of a standard form categorical syllogism. The first term I see is the term suicide. Unfortunately, it's not a plural noun or noun phrase, but I can make it into one pretty easily. Acts of suicide. Okay, so we're going to continue looking for our terms. Next one we come across is immoral, which is also not a plural noun or noun phrase, but again, we can make it one pretty easily. Moral actions. And you'll notice that I've chosen to use the term moral actions rather than immoral actions. And I'm choosing to do that because if I wanted to then say moral actions in the argument, I have to say non-immoral actions. And again, it's that sort of logical gymnastics I want to avoid. So I'm going to choose the simpler term, moral actions. And then anytime I want to say immoral actions, I'll just go ahead and say non-im. All right? Next term I see, actions that do not cause harm to others. I love it. I can just grab that as is. And there's the third term of my argument. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start writing out this argument in standard form categorical statements. No acts of suicide are immoral actions. That's the same thing as suicide is not immoral. Now, technically, I could have as my conclusion the aversion of this statement. All acts of suicide are moral actions. And here's where categorical logic gets kind of funky. When we say that an action is a moral action, one of the connotations is that the action is a good thing. Okay? When we say that no acts are immoral actions, not necessarily saying they're good things, but just saying they're not bad things. Okay? And what this premise statement says is, it doesn't say that suicide is a good thing. It just says it's not a bad thing. Okay, so I think the best translation of that conclusion statement here is that no acts of suicide are immoral actions. That leaves us with this part of the argument, this premise statement to translate. Actions that do not cause harm to others are not immoral. All right, how about no actions that do not cause harm to others are immoral actions? All right, so now we can see we've got our premise and we've got our conclusion. And what we can do is to see which terms have been used twice and which terms have been used only once. And we can see here that the major term of the argument, immoral actions, has been used twice, once in the premise and once in the conclusion. So we know that the missing statement, the missing premise, does not include the term immoral actions. We know that it includes the term acts of suicide and actions that do not cause harm to others because those terms have only been used once. All right, so now what we have to do is we have to figure out, well, what's the statement that involves H and S as terms? And we know from looking at the argument that this statement is going to have two properties. It's going to have to be universal because the conclusion is a universal statement. And all arguments with universal conclusions consist of premises that are all universal. And we know this. Rule number 3 says you cannot have negative premises. And we have one negative premise already. So we know that the missing premise has to be an all statement. It has to be a universal affirmative statement. Okay? So what is that statement? All acts of suicide are actions that do not cause harm to others. That's our missing premise. And it's highly questionable, right? Is it really the case that all acts of suicide are actions that do not cause harm to others? Well, I think most of us would beg to differ, right? Putting aside other, perhaps moral arguments we might make about the ethics of suicide, this argument involves this particular premise. And we can see that this particular premise is not a good premise because it's going to be really easy to challenge, because all we have to do is identify one person who's harmed by the suicide of another person. A spouse, a child, a friend, the longer list goes on here. Okay, so even though we have a valid argument, we have a clearly an unsound argument. Maybe even the first premise of this argument is also a false statement. Maybe it's not true that no actions that do not cause harm to others are immoral actions. So this argument, valid, unsound, because this unstated or missing premise is an untrue statement.